talk about how the intelligence community views Donald Trump's disastrous meeting with Vladimir Putin, and honestly, his equally disastrous meeting with our European allies. Former CIA Director John Brennan and other intelligence veterans are pointing out how easily Putin manipulated Trump, particularly without resistance. Remember, Putin is a former top KGB operative. He is trained in cultivating souls, shaping people, and using psychological tactics to his disadvantage. Some of those tactics were blatant, others more subtle. But Trump fell from all of them. He came back parroting Putin tall talking point word for word, insisting there should be no ceasefire, claiming the 2020 election was rigged because Putin told him so, even repeating bizarre lines like the country is hot as pistol, straight from Putin's mouth. Instead of representing American interests, Trump essentially became Putin's PR man, like Dmitry Peskov, Putin press secretary, spreading Kremlin propaganda back home. It takes me back to an article I read in Foreign Policy this past July that I have mentioned here before. When the threat is inside the White House, what CIA insider made the mega mole and toadies now reveals USA national security. The piece lays out the danger clearly. John Radcliffe, a loyal Trump operative installed at the CIA, mega headliner Cash Patel running the FBI, conspiracy theorist Tulsi Gabbard overseeing national intelligence, and Christian nationalist Patty Hegseth at the Pentagon. Together, Trump stacked the deck to create a national security nightmare. As Hannah observed decades ago, totalitarianism in power invariably replaces all first-rate talents, regardless of their sympathies, with those cracked spots and fools whose lack of intelligence and creativity is still the best guarantee of their loyalty. That's exactly what we are watching unfold. Former CIA Director John Brennan, now an MSNBC analyst, even suggests that Putin particularly microchipped Trump, turning him into the beast who now parrots current interest. Let's watch what he said.
So I think you could see on Putin's face, he felt very, very comfortable. And the fact that he was given a ride in the presidential limousine, the Beast, I certainly hope the Secret Service has swept that vehicle very well in terms of any type of, small microchip that might have been put in the vehicle. But then in the press conference, Vladimir Putin looked chipper.
He appeared upbeat, even laughing, while his foreign advisor, Sergey Lavrov, showed up wearing the USSR t-shirt. Meanwhile, Andrea Kendall, Taylor, a former senior CIA analyst, just gave an interview with Foreign Policy magazine. Here's what she said to say. Let's play the clip.
Many people now see with the summit that the worst fears of the analytic community going into the summit now appear to be in play. So number one, it was just the pageantry that we talked about. So Putin was able to secure this meeting on US soil with a US leader. He stood on the stage during the press conference and parroted his view of the war, how it started and what it's about without any rebuttal from the US president. One of the things that I fear the most is that he was successful in driving a wedge between the US on the one hand and Europe and Ukraine on the other by now putting the impetus back on the Ukrainians. I mean, I think that was one of the key goals that Putin had coming into this was to say yes, but, appear pragmatic, appear like he was ready to make a deal, and then frame the Ukrainians as the one being the barrier to peace. And I fear that's where we sit today. And quite notably, there were no concessions from the Russian side and no pressure, no sanctions. And so it really was a great success, I think, for President Putin in that, he's shifting the onus back onto the Ukrainians, raising the risk that the United States reapplies pressure to Ukraine, while also buying more time to prosecute this war. So all in all, I think it was a big win for the Russians, a big loss for Ukraine.
And now let's take a look at a former CIA official Robert Denberg. Here, what he told ABC. Roll the clip.
You were station chief in Moscow once. That's the head spy in Moscow. You knew Vladimir Putin at the time. He, of course, has that intelligence background as well. How did that play into what you saw play out in Alaska?
Yeah, thank you. People talk a lot about Vladimir Putin's background as a KGB officer, but what does that mean? It means he's a detail guy. It means that he's a guy who understands intelligence and its importance. For him as a head of state. He will have spent hours preparing for his meetings with Donald Trump. I think this was the 7th one that they've had, and he will have carefully factored in what his intelligence services tell him about Donald Trump and what's going on in the United States in his preparation for his meeting with the president on Friday.
So how did you see that play out, really?
Well, KGB training, like CIA training, is a lot about spotting, assessing, developing, and recruiting people to be intelligence sources. And in the case of Putin and Trump, it's about spotting, assessing, developing, and manipulating, which is also a key part of the intelligence equation. And what we saw on Friday, what we've seen in previous meetings, including Helsinki, was Putin showing that he had carefully prepared his remarks that he was going to make to Donald Trump, and they were designed to ingratiate himself with the President of the United States and put him in a position to manipulate the President's point of view.
Do you think he got what he wanted?
I think, didn't Donald Trump say he would know whether the meeting was going to be a success or a failure in the first 2 minutes? I would argue to you that Putin saw the same thing. When Putin got into the car with Trump and he turned and looked at the cameras and smirked, that was his 2-minute, I've got this.
Well said. Well said. Now let's bring in Ned Price, former senior analyst, the CEO, spokesperson who worked on the presidential daily briefing. Ned, break it down from your perspective. Let's start with Trump's meeting with Putin, then move his meeting with European allies, and finally where things go from here. But first, walk us through what you observed in that meeting with Putin.
Well, I think the clips you played were instructive. There are lots of concerns when any American president, let alone Donald Trump, is going to meet with Vladimir Putin, who has an intelligence background, who's been on the world stage for decades now. Yes, of course, you have to be worried about the concern that they might place some sort of technical listening device in the beast or take advantage of technological means to further their intelligence goals against the White House. I'm actually much less concerned about that. Number one, how much are you going to learn from listening to Donald Trump rabble and the beast? But number two, I think this, more seriously, there's another tactic I think that Putin was prioritizing here, and it's less about surveillance and it's more about, as you heard from Rob Dannenberg, manipulation. That is really, as Rob was saying, the key skill that intelligence officers learn when they're going through their training, whether they're KGB, whether they're CIA, whether they're any other intelligence, worthy intelligence outfit the world over. And it's not about, technology that will make you appear invisible or learning how to see through, hidden eyeballs in the back of your head. I think there are lots of misconceptions about what intelligence tradecraft is. It is really the art, and it is the art of, as Rob was saying, understanding someone, assessing someone, and then most importantly, lending the false impression to your target that you care about him or her, that you're interested in what they're talking about, and that you're on the same team. And I fear that's exactly what President Putin did from the moment he got into the beast with Donald Trump. We heard about some of that, including from Trump himself. He said that Putin raised mail-in voting. He said that Putin complimented him on some of the greatest hits from the campaign trail and really endorsed some of what he'd been saying. Obviously, so much of that was about manipulation. But then I think yesterday there was something really startling that hasn't gotten enough attention. President Trump was having a conversation with President Macron, and there was a hot mic. And President Trump sort of leaned over and said to President Macron, I think Putin wants to make a deal. I think he wants to make a deal for me. Very clearly, Putin left Trump with the impression that, you know what, I like you, we can work together, let's do this together. But he also left, and I think this is the most important point, President Trump embracing not Ukraine's view, not Europe's shared view, but the Kremlin's view. If you remember, Ben, President Trump went into the summit on Friday saying essentially, if there's not an immediate unconditional ceasefire, won't be happy. Moscow will face the severe consequences they were supposed to have faced the Friday before, Trump's own self-imposed deadline, and I'll walk away in 2 minutes if I don't hear that. And then, lo and behold, a couple hours later, the two men appear on stage together. President Trump has fully embraced President Putin's vision of a so-called peace deal. There was nothing to be heard or found of a ceasefire deal. And he was saying things like it's up to President Zelensky now to make peace. So President Putin was absolutely successful. He was most successful in the skills that he learned in the KGB, manipulating, bringing, and really cementing President Trump in his camp.
The entire setup, Trump stayed in Alaska, essentially trapped him before the meeting even began. On top of the taxes Putin was already going to use, by literally rolling out the red carpet, having American troops kneel to unfurl it, standing and a building, and framing the stage with message about peace or whatever slogan was behind him. Trump or anyone in that position box himself in. The optics made it look less like a high-stake negotiation and more like he was greeting long-lost partner with a grand display. In that environment, the only possible public rejection could come from Putin, not Trump. That's what made it so glaring. Trump handed Putin the win in the atmosphere alone. It showed just how terrible of a negotiator how could he expect to strike a favorable deal when he have away leverage before talks even started by ceding the getting itself?
It's such an own goal. Look, there have been a number of elements that have been useful to Ukraine in its efforts to defend itself against Russian aggression over the past several years. Number one was the diplomatic, economic isolation and pressure that Russia has felt. And just by inviting President Putin to U.S. soil, by feting him with this arrival ceremony that is not even reserved for our closest allies. Can you think of the last time? Has there ever been a time where there's been a B-2 flyover for any country, let alone one of our closest allies? And with that arrival ceremony, with the setup, as you said, President Trump undid so much of what dozens of countries around the world have worked for several years to put in place. This political isolation, diplomatic isolation with sanctions and other forms of economic pressure, this economic isolation. And then you have the optics of it all. What President Putin has coveted, especially since President Obama called Russia a quote unquote regional power in the waning days of his second term, is nothing more than to stand on the same plane as the US president, to stand side by side, to be seen as an equal. And in some ways, President Trump didn't make President Putin come off as an equal. He made him come off as a superior. Again, the pageantry, allowing him to speak first during the press conference, allowing him to set the rules for the press conference where they didn't take questions. President Putin got everything he wanted optically. He got everything he wanted in terms of the imagery. But again, I am most concerned that he got everything he wanted substantively, because he left Anchorage with President Trump firmly in his camp. Even after a day of engagement with the Europeans yesterday at the White House, President Trump hasn't moved off that Russian position. He continues to advocate for it to this very hour.
That's why I always tell our audience, strip away the noise and focus on the facts. In Alaska, was a ceasefire achieved? No, and that was supposed to be central goal, the one Trump himself set. Then look at Europe. Did Putin agree to trilateral meeting with Zelensky and Trump? No. Did he agree to the so-called Article 5 style guarantee that Trump and his allies keep touting? And that part of the media is unscientifically parroting. Again, no, Russia has been clear in its own media. They never agreed to any NATO-like security guarantee, and they never signed on to a ceasefire. What's even more, troubling is that much of the press is amplifying Trump's claim without spelling out how disastrous the reality was. From a American geopolitical perspective, that European meeting was not just a misstep. It's hard to see it as anything other than one of the biggest diplomatic failure in recent memory.
Look, there's been a lot of fawning coverage of what happened at the White House yesterday. And if you grade on a curve, if you grade on the Trump curve, yes, it was a good meeting in the sense that President Zelensky was welcomed back to the White House. President Trump said nice things to him. He said nice things back to President Trump. President Zelensky wasn't thrown out on the street after 45 minutes. In fact, he was there for several hours. Several other European leaders were there. They fawned over President Trump. So in that sense, again, the imagery was good. It was certainly, when it comes to Ukraine, far better than what happened at the end of February. And if that's what we have to choose from, either February or yesterday, I'll take yesterday. I'll take yesterday any day. But when you, just as you said, take a step back and think about the facts. President Trump went into the meeting yesterday, coming off his meeting with President Putin in Alaska on Friday, embracing President Putin's proposal for a so-called peace agreement, rejecting the idea that the shooting needs to stop first in the form of a ceasefire, something that Europe and Ukraine have been unanimous and consistent in saying. And then at the end of the day, backing off what he had said previously, that there would be this trilateral between Zelensky, Putin, and himself, where at least President Zelensky would have some backup when it comes to meeting with the nuclear-armed neighbor that is in the process of invading him and killing his citizens. And by the end of the day, even that was off the table. And it was sort of, over to you, Volodymyr, to work with Putin, the guy who is every single day killing your citizens, to arrange this meeting. And if that works out, then, we'll have a trilateral. But when you look at the substance, President Trump has not moved. President Putin's positions have remained firm. And President Trump, despite all the happy talk in the room yesterday, was parroting exactly what President Putin has pushed on him.
So let game this out, both short term and long term. I have been telling our audience that in the long run, many of our so-called allies, really allies in name only, at this point are drifting away. It's sad to see how America has treated Canada, Europe, and Australia. We would not even grant a meeting to Anthony Albanese in Australia, yet Trump rushes to sit down with Vladimir Putin. And beyond that, countries like India and others are clearly beginning to de-risk from the United States. What Rubio once described as multipolar world is taking shape. Thought he probably imagined America would remain one of the strongest poles. Instead, we are looking weaker and more isolated. But let me get your take out both timelines. In the short term, how do Ukraine, Europe, and remaining coalition of willing negative this reality? Knocking Trump could be drawn back under Putin influence at any moment. Do they fall into purely defensive posture? They try to maximize Russian losses and hold out for the next 4 years. Do they focus on saving as much of Donbass as possible, even if that means conceding incremental Russian advances? And then long term, what do you see as trajectory for Ukraine, Europe and USA influence in this shifting global order?
Yeah, well, first the short term, and I'll tell you my fear. My fear is that President Putin is again just playing for time, and his apparent rejection of a trilateral meeting, to me, is a data point. It's not dispositive, but it is a data point that he doesn't intend to meet with President Zelensky. That he is willing to stand up President Zelensky, but he didn't want to also, at the same time, stand up President Trump. And so by disaggregating them and potentially suggesting, maybe Volodymyr and I will get together first, and if that goes well, we'll bring you into it. That's just his stall tactic. And I would actually be surprised if a meeting between Ukraine and Russia at the leader level materializes over the coming weeks. And even Russian media is starting to say the issue was broached as to whether there could be more senior level contacts. It's very, very non-committal, and I don't think that's a very good sign. So I think the task that's between Russia and Ukraine. If there's a trilateral following that, great. I think that will be to certainly Ukraine's benefit and to Europe's benefit. But I think the real task between the United States and Europe and Ukraine over the short term is to work out these security guarantees and what exactly that looks like, what the United States is going to contribute. Here again is a concern because the security guarantees, in one sense, that's actually the easier part of the equation. We're really negotiating between and among our allies and partners, Ukraine, Europe, and others. Russia shouldn't get a veto over what security guarantees Ukraine gets, but here too, the Trump administration might see otherwise, tragically. The real difficult question comes with the idea of land and territory. And, on one level, you can guarantee a really terrible deal, and that will just be tantamount to surrender. If you're guaranteeing Russia's permanent possession of 20 or 20+% of Ukrainian territory, along with no NATO, along with no military, along with potentially a change in government, that guarantee isn't worth anything, and it's not something we should be pushing for. So really the territorial question is going to be the more difficult one. I think over the longer term, Ben, I think Europe, despite the happy face they put on, and I should say the vast majority of these European leaders see President Trump as a vulgarian. They go there and they stroke his ego because they know they have to. They're holding their noses. They don't like him. They don't like what he stands for, but they've seen the alternative and they don't want the alternative. So I think they are wise to the fact that they are going to have to become more independent. I think they are wise to the fact that to the extent that Ukraine will continue to need security assistance into the future, it's going to depend on purchases from, not contributions from the United States to Ukraine. And I think above all of that, there are going to be certain European leaders, I think President Macron chief among them, who are going to be pushing for Europe to go its own way more and more, to go its own way in terms of its own security, in terms of its economic interests, in terms of its diplomatic interests around the world. You're starting to see this divergence. It's not something that has started within the past 6 months, but I think the Trump administration has really accelerated it. And over the next 3.5 years, I fear that Europe can make a good amount of progress if it feels incentivized to go its own way, to create that daylight with and from the United States. That's certainly not in our interest. It's not in Europe's interest over the long term. But Europe, unfortunately, not without reason, believes that they have no alternative at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Take Canada, for example. They have got the F-35, but they are already revealing whether they even want to follow through with the purchase. So, realistically, there's an other aircraft on the market that matches what they need. Meanwhile, Europe is realizing it has to step up and building more of its own weapon. Japan is the process of rebuilding its military all around the world. You can see how nations are recalibrating in response to weaker and less reliable America. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you think deserves more coverage? Something that is not getting nearly enough attention, but that people really should know about?
Well, Ben, I think Russia-Ukraine is really dominating the news, but to some extent it is, I think, eclipsing so much of what else is going on in the world right now. When's the last time that the mainstream media has really covered Gaza, the abject failure of American leadership there? There has been no American leadership there. And I think to some extent, President Trump really pushed for this showy, flashy summit on Friday. Yes, I think there was some sense that he wanted to get a deal between Russia and Ukraine, which still appears elusive, but to some extent, this is intentional. And he wanted to block out coverage of Epstein. He wanted to block out coverage of inflation, of some of the economic indicators. And so he has put on a show. We have watched that show, but we also need to continue watching everything else that's going on around the world. And unfortunately, here too, all the terrible things that this administration is inflicting on us here at home.
You are absolutely right about Trump always being graded on the curve. Remembering that meeting with the King Abdullah of Jordan, Trump suddenly declared, Gaza is mine, I am taking it, it belongs to me. right there standing next to King Abdullah, and media just froze like what is he even talking about? And when press Trump doubled down, saying it's done, it's mine, be quiet, it's our. He framed it like some kind of real estate deal, which is in fact was a green light to Netanyahu. And now, if you look at what's happening in Tel Aviv, something our corporate media bravely touches, there are massive protests against Netanyahu action.